Through the forges of a turbulent and violent region of Europe, the Cossacks emerged as a skilled fighting force upon land, being famous particularly for their abilities on horseback. But being squished between three land-hungry imperial powers and nomadic steppe raiders forced these men to be creative in the ways that they fought. So, not only did they develop their land-based combat, they also took to the seas. At this point in history, the Cossacks of Zaporizhia were semi-independent. The land, while officially Lithuanian, was an autonomous region, where Cossacks usually took foreign policy into their own hands. The Cossacks had a strange and turbulent relationship with Poland-Lithuania, for, in many ways, the Cossacks swore fealty to the Polish crown, and fought alongside it in several campaigns, on the promise of concessions and rewards for their involvement, while being attacked by the Polish nobility several times when they became too rebellious, and their independent nature pulled them a little too far from the Polish crown. Because they sought somewhat democracy and individual freedom in their lands, the Cossacks became very popular among peasants, many of whom flocked to their lands, bolstering Cossack manpower and bargaining power. All the while, it made the expansion of the Zaporizhian host very easy throughout much of Ukraine, since they could rely on a sympathetic peasantry. Obviously, the Cossacks and the peasants that fled to their lands resented the Poles for their attempts to impose Polish ways of life upon them, and restrict the freedoms guaranteed by the Cossack host, often leading to the Cossacks rebelling. Tatars of Crimea had, in the past, raided as far as Moscow and Vilnius, due to the flat, difficult-to-defend borders of the Polish and Russian empires. So, Poland, Lithuania, and Russia saw the Cossacks as a buffer between them and these Tatars, and thus, it was in their interest to keep the Cossacks around. At the same time, the Cossacks themselves were raiding these nations. But as long as the steppes of Ukraine remained so turbulent and difficult to settle, the Cossacks were marginally loyal with their skilled warriors, and they took the brunt of Tatar raids. Poland was willing to swallow their pride, and mostly let them be. As well, the Zaporizhian Cossacks often came to blows with the Ottoman Empire, as their vassal, the Crimean Tatars, caused much damage and took many slaves in their continued raids upon Ukrainian lands. Independence and individualism were core tenets of the Cossacks, which, paired with the raiding tendencies of these men to gain personal wealth, made it very difficult to maintain positive relations with neighbors. Even when the hetman, or leader of the Cossacks himself, advised against attacking certain parties, often rogue groups would raid said nearby nations, deteriorating any goodwill. Simultaneously, the Turks were expanding and only gaining steam. Many say that by the turn of the 17th century, they had turned the Black Sea into an Ottoman lake. The Ottomans were able to achieve this through a systematic and targeted conquest of the mouth of rivers that entered the Black Sea and important commercial ports. Once in control of this sea access, they choked crucial trade to the nations that relied upon it, and forced them into Ottoman vassalage or annexation, with very little fighting. This conquest exploded the wealth of the Ottoman Empire, with trade from far reaches of the world flowing through the waters of the Black Sea, and vassals sailing their riches to the imperial center. Ships were almost guaranteed safe passage now through this sea, as, with no enemies or rivals upon the shores, piracy was almost non-existent, for now. A historian, Ibn Kemal, regarded this period of the Black Sea with great admiration in his writing, saying, "The Black Sea became fully controlled, and evil people of sedition no longer inhabited these parts. People of evil intent were not able to remain on its shores. No places of ambush remained for thieves and robbers. And due to the perceived security of trade in the Black Sea, very little had to be invested into defending the routes of this lucrative, abundant trade. The Crimean Khanate in their raids northwards into Ukraine and the surrounding empires provided vital sources of slaves for the Ottoman Empire and their large slave market, in a process known as the harvesting of the steppe. Having the Tatars on the northern shores of the Black Sea allowed for the Ottomans to worry about their many other volatile borders and wars elsewhere in the empire, while not compromising their source of slaves. Black Sea trade was one of the reasons that the Ottomans were able to reach the wealth, power, and prestige that they did, and ensured their new capital, Istanbul, became the largest city in Europe. Zaporizhian Cossacks, despite being known for their cavalry, from their inception have been tied to the Dnipro river systems for transport, trade, protection, and military tactics. To accommodate their dependency upon rivers, the Cossacks, before they had even been known as Cossacks and were simply frontiersmen, began to build boats that they called chaiki. Chaiki were made with the intention of maneuverability. having shallow bodies to cross the vicious rapids of the Dnipro, and having dual helms, so that the ship did not have to be turned around, but rowers could simply turn around. It also helped that these ships were very cheap to produce, and large enough to fit up to 50 men in later developments. Chaiki were initially created with the sole use of transport of cargo and men to the battlefield, but as the relationship with these vessels evolved, they were increasingly used as military ships. This can be seen in one of the earliest mentions of the Cossacks in writing. The Sultan Suleiman I had been complaining about Polish raids upon Tatar lands after a truce was signed, and described tribal chiefs that came down the Dnipro in Chaiki to attack Ochakiv. These Cossacks were able to conquer and pillage the fortress, which symbolically opened the Black Sea to further expeditions, sailing to distant shores, far from the Cossack heartland. Here we see the beginnings of Cossack Black Sea activity, as they began attacking Ottoman settlements along the western shore of the Black Sea with their chaikas in retaliation for Tatar raids. This caused much tension between the Ottomans and the Commonwealth, to the extent that the Ottomans demanded that the Poles get the Zaporizhian Cossacks in line. Despite the Poles not wanting to create such a powerful enemy, and seem like they were breaking a previous truce, they could only respond. The Cossacks are an unstable, disobedient, and immoral race of fugitives with no fatherland, safe in its hideouts and haunts the Dnipro and other rivers. It has no property of its own, is dangerous to other people's property, and recognizes nor tolerates any authority over it. This defines the uncontrollable relationship that the Cossacks had with their rulers, and recognizes the impossible feat of controlling these men reliably, while taking the time to insult their character as well. The Poles did ask the Hetman to stop his attacks upon the Ottomans, but he did not listen, and went on to attack the settlements of Bilhorod and Vilja. Here the Cossacks found that their chaiki worked exceptionally well in the open waters of the Black Sea, their short stature making it difficult to spot from far away, allowing for the element of surprise. Minor raids of these sorts became very common, catching the Ottomans off guard in the water they once thought to be the safest in the empire. Galleys of the Ottoman Empire were even known to be commandeered by these Cossacks in daring boarding missions, and were used against the Turks in turn. One of the earliest bountiful naval assaults was of the settlement of Varna, where the Cossacks took over 180,000 zloty in treasures. However, in this period of growing their sea legs, the smaller raids of the Cossacks were much more common and widespread, causing terror in the underdefended and underprepared sea. Accumulation of wealth, prestige, and skill from these expeditions, paired with other land-based victories, allowed the Cossacks to further expand their influence and power in Ukraine. But soon the Cossacks became distracted with their protracted involvement in the Russian time of troubles. At the time, this was the largest unified mobilization of the Cossacks, and a costly one at that. What this means is that the Cossacks were restricted from investment into their navy, but minor raids on settlements along the Balkan and Crimean coasts would continue. On top of the already unstable relations caused by the Cossack naval and land raids, tensions between the Poles and Turks had been steadily mounting over competing goals in Moldavia and Tatar raids, both successful and intercepted. One attack upon the Crimean coast by Cossacks eventually triggered the Ottomans to intercept these chaiki on their journey home, hoping to catch them at the mouth of the Dnipro. Outnumbered against this fleet of galleys, the Cossacks attacked the Turkish ships at night, catching them off guard, and routing them thoroughly. This was a breaking point in diplomacy, and the Ottomans began mustering an army to prepare for war against the Commonwealth, who did not want this, and tried to avoid war at all costs. The only way that they could do this was to stop the Cossack raids. But no matter the diplomatic strategy the king took, the Cossacks were emboldened by their victory, and in the summer, they set off with 2,000 men to an area that not only had never experienced the vicious Cossacks, but had never conceived that they could be reached by such men. The Ukrainian ships arrived at Sinop, and the Zaporizhians went to work destroying military implements, gathering as much loot as they could, and razing the settlement and fortress. Hearing of another awaiting Ottoman ambush at Ochakiv, some of the Cossacks on their way home attempted an overland route around the enemy ships, while some tried to brute force their way through. Neither attempt was very successful, losing a lot of the captured valuables to the Turks and Tatars. But now the Ottomans, further enraged, were fully invested in war against the Poles. Frantically, the Commonwealth tried to get the Cossacks in check, but the weak king at the time, Sigismund III, had no real means of stopping the raids, beyond empty threats. The Cossacks saw through his bluff, and carried out an unimaginable feat, taking 80 ships behind Ottoman defenses and striking at the heart of the empire. In early spring, the Cossacks arrived in Istanbul, the capital of the Ottoman Empire. Here they plundered as much as they could and burnt 2 important ports to the ground, so close to the Sultan's palace that he could see the smoke from his window. A fleet immediately set after the Ukrainians, but could only catch up with their nimble ships at the Danube, and even then, when engaged in battle, the Cossacks emerged victorious. In battle, they captured dozens of Ottoman seacraft, and in a display of power, in front of the garrison at Tochakiv, they destroyed each one, and proceeded to raid the settlement. Fortunately for the Poles and Cossacks, the Ottomans had to sufficiently commit forces to a war with Safavid Persia at the time, so what ensued instead of the planned war was a devastation to Polish lands by Tatar raiders. As well, another Turkish fleet was sent against the Cossacks, but once again, it was defeated. In the wake of this victory, Crimea was left virtually undefended from the sea, and what ensued was a widespread Cossack campaign against the coastal Crimean lands that resulted in the destruction of Kaffa. The victory over Kaffa was very important to the Cossacks, as this was the most heavily fortified city in Crimea, and one of the largest slave ports in the Black Sea. Thousands of slaves were freed during this raid and allowed to return home, most of whom were Ukrainian. This series of events was indescribably embarrassing for such a powerful empire as the Ottomans. So, with what army they could muster, they planned to conquer the lands of the Dnipro and take care of the Cossack menace themselves. And yet, during another desperate bid to appease the Ottomans through diplomacy from the Commonwealth, another Cossack expedition was sent to Anatolia. This time, they arrived in Trabzon. With little resistance, the Cossacks looted, and hearing of the tired tactic of an Ottoman fleet waiting for them at Tochakiv, the Cossacks sailed into the Sea of Azov and rode the tributaries of the Dnipro home. By the time the naval commander of the intercepting fleet realized that they had been bypassed, the Cossacks had dispersed from their siege capital into the countryside for the winter. Not wanting to return without a victory after such humiliation, said Ottoman fleet sailed up the Dnipro, only to find an empty siege. They nonetheless took some guns and loot with them to please the Sultan with a phony victory. Furious at the news of this Cossack campaign and what it meant for the Commonwealth, the Polish crown threatened the Cossacks, and diplomatic inroads were attempted. Antagonistically, the Cossacks more openly prepared for another assault upon Ottoman lands, demonstrating to the Poles that they had no power over them. The Poles knew that this last raid was the final straw, and quickly mustered as many men as they could, as the Turks heard of the raid, and marched tens of thousands of their own troops north. Most of the Commonwealth army was distracted with the Muscovite War at the time, so the forces gathered were green and insufficient to stop an incoming Ottoman attack, but they were many and gave the impression of an adequate force. The armies met at the Polish border on opposing sides of the Dniester, but because of the lack of Ottoman intelligence about Polish troops, the sheer size of each army, and a Polish defeat would mean the Commonwealth would be virtually undefended, neither side wanted to make a move. The standoff was tense, and in negotiations, the Poles realized that the mirage of a formidable army allowed for minimal concessions, only having to rein in the Cossacks, renounce any intentions in Ottoman Balkan kingdoms, and pay tribute to the Crimeans. With no loyalty to the Commonwealth, the Cossacks did not support the crown with troops in this standoff, even though they had gotten the nation into this situation in the first place. The leader of the Polish army, Crown Hetman Stanisław Żołewski, wheeled his forces around towards the Cossacks, wholly prepared to send his feeble troops at them. A conflict with the Ukrainians would cause indescribable destruction to both sides, which would leave the Commonwealth crippled, show the Russians and Turks that they were weak, and lose an important source of skilled fighters for the crown. So, Żołewski preferred diplomacy. With this leverage, the Cossacks were able to slip by negotiations with minimal sacrifices. Most importantly, they were forced to destroy all of their Chaike for 6,000 zloty, and could not raid Ottoman lands. Knowing that the Polish still hated them and their resistance to Polish ways, the Cossacks feared the moment that Polish troops were free from their Russian engagement, as they surely would be set upon the Hetmanate. The Cossacks thus focused on bolstering their troop numbers, and did all that they could to keep the Poles in a state of war, distracting their best forces. This was primarily achieved through attacking Crimea, a decision also welcomed by the crown, as it distracted the Cossack troops, while keeping within the bounds of the treaty agreed upon. Things would change as Yakov Borodavka was elected hetman of the Cossacks, for he was more rebellious than the previous hetman, and was more keen to listen to popular sentiment, rather than focus on the long term. The Cossacks demanded a naval raid, and the hetman delivered, and was not quiet about it in its preparation, to the extent that the Sultan began hearing of these plans. All the while, the Polish aided their allies in Hungary against Transylvania, an Ottoman vassal, which angered the Ottomans, who in response to both of these events, prepared for war. Preparations included building fortifications on the northern coast of the Black Sea, in hopes to avoid the threats of Cossack naval raids, but even still, a Cossack fleet skirted by. Memories of previous attacks were fresh in the minds of Ottoman sailors, and stories had spread through the Ottoman ranks and peasantry of these fearsome warriors, and the damage they caused the Ottoman navy with little effort. So, as Cossack ships once again sailed towards Istanbul, there are stories of Ottoman sailors having to be forced upon their galleys out of terror of the enemy. Clearly, the morale of the Ottoman ships wavered as the Ukrainians attacked, and the city was freely looted, followed by an attack upon Varna. Eventually, a better fleet was organized, and a battle ensued, the result of which we do not know. Stories range from only a few Cossack ships being able to flee, to a complete destruction of the Ottoman fleet. A costly war ensued, with both the Commonwealth and Ottomans taking heavy losses. So, in the peace treaty, both sides reaffirmed the earlier treaty that said that the Cossacks were no longer able to take to the sea. But because without the investment of the Cossack army in this war, the Polish would have lost, the Cossacks gained leverage in the ensuing discussions about future Cossack policy. Promises to the Ottomans to tame the Cossacks were doomed for many reasons. The Cossacks were attracted to the high yields of their expeditions. Some Cossacks joined the Don Cossack raids, trying to circumvent the treaty. The Polish king had no army to leverage against the Cossacks due to recent preoccupations, and the Cossacks were hopped up by their military victories in the previous war. Also, in talks with the Cossacks, they stipulated that if they were not paid their salaries on time, they would set out to sea, and that date had long gone. The Cossacks were given the perfect opportunity to conduct this raid, as the Crimean Khanate requested the aid of the Cossacks in their attempts to shake the suzerainty of the Ottomans. And because the Ottoman Black Sea Fleet was in Crimea, dealing with this rebellion, the Cossacks had a free route straight to Istanbul. In this year, they raided this capital of the world not once, not twice, but 3 times, seeing extreme successes and high amounts of loot every time. The Cossacks entered an alliance with Crimea, which opened the sea to further expeditions of this sort, and immediately they set to work building as many boats as they could. Hearing of this, Polish envoys were sent to dissuade the Cossacks. In addition, Orthodoxy had also been a large area of contention in recent years, as the Cossacks were Orthodox and the Commonwealth was a Catholic nation. The Cossacks no longer felt that they should bow to the will of the king, especially as they had established better relations with the Orthodox in Russia. Summer soon came around, which brought with it the campaign season upon the sea, where the prepared Cossack fleet of hundreds of ships terrorized the Trabzon coast. By this point, the Cossacks were the most feared element in the Black Sea. French cartographer Guillaume Beauplan described that when they took to the waters, the alarm is then sounded throughout the whole country, even as far as Constantinople. The Sultan sends messengers all along the coast of Anatolia, Bulgaria, and Rumeli, warning that the Cossacks have put to sea, so that everyone may be on his guard. Said Cossack fleet on their return voyage from Trabzon met with one of the largest, most experienced Ottoman fleets as of yet at the usual place of battle, Ochakov. A brutal slog of a battle ensued, with Cossacks able to board the admiral's ship. The attack was only stopped as a vicious wind capsized several Cossack ships. However, the battle was not in any way decisive. Expeditions continued throughout this season, but did not bring as much success to the Cossacks as they had hoped, especially as they lost a few encounters to the Turks. At the same time, because of the massive manpower investment into this campaign, the Polish crown attacked the Cossacks over the countless reasons that they hated the unruly men. And this is where the raids became much less frequent, with Cossacks focusing on their increasingly precarious situation with Poland and neighbors, and striving for independence. Cossackdom itself waned after the rebellion of Bohdan Khmelnytsky and the subsequent period of time known as the Ruin, which devastated Ukrainian lands. Although, small groups of Zaporizhians continued their piracy in the Black Sea, causing havoc to the extent that even small parties were brought to the attention of the Sultan, and captured Cossacks, or their severed heads, were some of the most prized possessions of the navy, army, and Sultan himself. It is said that a sort of ritual had begun, where when a Cossack head was procured, it was immediately delivered to the Sultan, who would inspect it. In the Ottoman Empire, beheading was one of the most humiliating ways of death, and was reserved to those the empire believed heeded the utmost disrespect. From the countless fruitful expeditions of the Cossack navy, tales of their exploits spread throughout Europe, which had been for centuries in great fear of the powerful Muslim empire. And that was the Cossack navy highlighted. Please like and subscribe if you liked the video, and if you have any suggestions or comments, leave them in the comment section below, or email me with my email in the description. I also started a Patreon if anyone is interested in supporting a small creator like myself.